Hey guys, it's Courtney and I am here with a video using some products from Neat and Tangled. I'm using the Magnolia stamp set as well as the Hexastar stencil. I am starting off with a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 4 by 5 1/4, and I'll be stamping my images with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink because I will be Copic coloring them. My plan was to do a little floral arrangement right on the top of my card, but I wanted to pop up this larger image. So I'm stamping it down on my card panel just strictly for placement. And then I'll also be stamping it on a scrap piece of the Neenah Solar White as well, because I'll fussy cut that out later. On either side of this larger floral, I am doing these little stems and smaller flowers. And I'll be masking those out because I will be doing some ink blending on this card panel, but I won't worry about masking out that center one. I am using the masking paper by Simon Says Stamp. These are pretty intricate. The flowers are nice and easy. There's a bolder outline on these stamps, so they're pretty easy to cut out, but the stems and leaves are pretty intricate. You can cut the mask apart into 2 or 3 separate masks to make it a little bit easier. I didn't do that just because I was afraid that they were going to kind of come up when I was going to be doing my ink blending. So once I had my masks down, I'll be using that stencil and 2 colors of Distress Oxide inks in the colors Twisted Citron and Cracked Pistachio. Whenever I use a stencil for ink blending, I typically use the Post-it note tape just to tape the back of it so that it doesn't move around as I'm applying my ink. You can also use Tombow Mono multi-glue on the entire stencil, let that dry, and then it's repositionable. I'm just laying out a little bit of color on my card panel here just so that it's not completely white where the stencil will be. I'm not worrying about getting a blend here. It's just laying down just a little bit of color. Next, I will place my stencil on top of that panel and add even more of the ink, concentrating on the lightest colors being in the center of the panel and the Cracked Pistachio being on all of the edges. Once all of my ink blending was done, I went ahead and removed my masks. Now, whenever you use Distress ink or Distress Oxide ink especially, you want to make sure that you're really careful removing your masks. Because the oxides have pigment ink in them, they tend to make your masks wet. So when you remove them, it's easy to kind of tear the paper. So you just want to either give it a few minutes to dry a little bit or just be extremely careful. Next, I'll move on to the Copic coloring. I'm going to color all of the flowers the same way. I'm going to start off with my lightest color, lay out where my darkest areas will be, then go on with my darkest color, my 2 midtones, and then my lightest color. Now I'm using RV markers here, and for some reason I have a little bit of trouble with those sometimes. I love the colors, so I use them often, but you want to make sure that you're not over blending here. It's easy to kind of pick up and move around the darker colors when you place your lightest color on there. So when I use my RV markers, I'm still using that flicking motion like I normally do. But when I'm going on to my lighter colors, especially that RV11, which is the lightest color I'm using, I'm placing it down and leaving it there. If it's not completely blended, I'd rather have that than kind of have a muddy mess at the end, and then you have to worry about it bleeding outside of your image and things like that. For the larger flower that I have here stamped on the scrap paper, I'm doing the same exact thing. Now there are lines within the stamp that you can kind of make them anything you want. You can make it so that it looks like the petal is folded over on itself, which I did in some areas. So I just kind of laid out a little bit of a shadow there. And then others I kind of just left as is, not worrying about that area having a shadow on it. But I am doing the same thing, starting off with my lightest, going to my darkest, my two midtones, and then my lightest. The little tiny petals that are kind of behind the rest of the flower, those are pretty much going to be the two darkest colors. There's going to be a very small highlight on those because they're laying behind all the other petals. Pretty much the entire petal will be a shadow. For my leaves and stems, I'm coloring those the same way as well. I'm only using two colors here. I'm using two BG markers. And because the areas are very small, especially on the card panel itself, not so much this image, I'm starting off with my darkest color. I'm not worrying about really shading here or the lines within the leaves. I'm just putting the darkest areas where the leaves are kind of underneath the flower itself. And then I'll go in with my lightest color and just blend that out a little bit. For the center, for the center of the flower, I'm just using that Y38 marker, not doing any blending or anything like that. Once all my coloring was done, I went ahead and fussy cut out that larger flower that we stamped there on the scrap paper. Now, when you're fussy cutting, I find it easier to move the paper with my left hand and kind of keep the scissors as straight as I can with my right hand. Also, when you kind of have a little bit too much of that paper that's kind of hanging down underneath, just snip that off so that it doesn't get in your way. And I'm cutting right along the black line here. I don't want any kind of white border around this image. Once I had that fussy cut out, I used a water-based marker just to go around the edges so that you don't see exactly where I cut. Plus, it kind of disguises any areas that you might have not gotten a perfect cut. I usually do this from the back in case my pen slips a little bit. Then I'm basically just streaking the back of it and nobody will see it. Next, for my sentiment, I'm going to be heat embossing this right on my card panel. And here I'm just taking my clear embossing powder and just kind of testing out the area, make sure that my ink, my distress ink, is dry enough to go ahead and emboss. So I'm using an anti-static tool and a VersaFine Onyx Black ink to stamp my sentiment. Then I'll add Hero Arts clear embossing powder and go ahead and heat set that. Whenever you use the VersaFine ink, you want to make sure that you clean your stamp right away. Although it doesn't dry immediately on paper, it seems to dry pretty quick on your stamp. So you'll just want to take a couple seconds to make sure that your stamp is clean. Once my sentiment was done, I used Scotch foam tape to go ahead and pop that flower up right over top of the stamped image that we did right in the beginning on that card panel. And I added a little bit of shimmer with a Nuvo sparkle pen. I adhered the entire card panel onto a black note card just to make sure that I had just a little bit of a border around the card panel itself. Last, I added a few Nuvo drops in the color Rhubarb Crumble just around that sentiment. Now, when I use the Nuvo drops, I always squirt a little bit out on my scrap paper just to make sure that there's no air bubbles in there. And that is it for today. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.